This podcast is a Royfield Brown production. Find others on iTunes.
All right. Yeah, I know.
Hello and welcome. This is me, Royfield, back for another intelligent speech. And with us, we have a man who wears at least two hats. What do I call you today? Do you go by your nom de plume or by your government name? Which one is it?
Let's, for the sake of things, let's just call me Claude for right now. Claude's not exactly my real name, but I'm a teacher, and so I use this ridiculous nickname my dad made up for me. He used to make up just bizarre names, and I put this one up on Facebook so that my students couldn't track me. Not that I'm doing anything illicit, I just, you like to leave some space, and for some reason this just kind of stuck among, I guess, people who listen, so why not?
And it's stuck in large part now because you have a podcast. And this is the name that you go by on your podcast.
Yeah. Some would call it a podcast, some would call it a cry for help. But,
Well, what exactly do you call what you do? So the podcast is called The Cannonball. As I understand it, you are looking at Harold Bloom's list of the essential tomes in Western literature. That's what I think your podcast is about. Or why don't you tell me if I'm missing a beat there?
What we're doing, my co-host and friend Daniel and I are trying to read all the books in the Western canon. And it's as ambitious and ridiculous as it sounds. But in the 90s, I think it was like 96 or 97, Harold Bloom, this Yale literary critic, wrote this gigantic screed sort of bemoaning the fate of English departments and whatnot. And he came up with this list of the essential works of Western literature. Most people, I think rightly, kind of dismissed the screed part. I mean, it's just a lot of ranting and belly aching and fussy old madness. But what he's got is this gigantic list at the back of here are the essential works. And it's not necessarily that he's being absolutely revanchist in his outlook. Like, apparently in his politics, he was pretty leftist. But what he's arguing for is a kind of aesthetic approach to literature that sort of gets lost in the professionalization. And so he's got this list that he thinks are the sort of aesthetic greats, the things that sort of create an affective response. And he kind of, I guess, ended his academic career with that. Everything else was sort of like, I mean, it was more or less all downhill from the 80s on. But Daniel and I decided, we get along and we're interested in reading this stuff. And we're trying to, get through it and have fun with it. Daniel's a librarian and I'm an academic. I have a PhD in 20th and 21st century American poetry, which means that for the next however long until I die or leave academia, I'm going to be teaching freshman writing. So I'm never going to get a chance to look at any of the stuff that I really love to read. And this is a chance to sort of talk to a friend of mine about, stuff that's really fascinating or interesting that we'd never be able to address otherwise. It's literary appreciation. It's personal monologues thrown in there. It's background in history and some sort of like lit crit type stuff. But I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to take a look at is, what is our effective response to this? Like, what is our emotional or aesthetic, reaction to all of this stuff that usually, you have to stroke your beard and take a look at, 17 people are dead on stage and you have to say, well, I really like the way they use the word this repeatedly in the play, right?
Bloom did this list when? Was it in the 80s when he put together the list?
90, I think it was 96.
Okay.
He begins with, I think the Hebrew Bible and ends with Tony Kushner, I think is the most recent one.
Okay. So,
go ahead. Sorry.
So that's 25 years ago.
Yeah.
How much of the list just in 25 years do you think, before we go into what constitutes the list, the canon, how much of it do you think, he's put that person in there a little bit kind of questionable, he's put that book in, I don't know about that. How much of our tastes change in terms of literary criticism just in those 25 years?
Oh, everything. It's always changing. And that's the thing. In the 90s in academia, there was this whole canon wars. Like what Bloom was responding to were changes in the way that literature was being addressed, and really sort of changes in what could be, I guess, an object of academic study, right? So now we have this stuff called cultural studies, where you can take the same kinds of literary theory and apply it to pop cultural material. And I mean, people have been doing that for 20 years or 30 years. It's a different kind of ballgame. So what you're doing is shifting what gets taken seriously as cultural material, or shifting sort of, well, yeah, I guess I would say it that way, shifting what you take seriously as cultural material. So some stuff gets let in, some stuff gets let out. A lot of stuff that was being introduced in the 90s, unfortunately, that he's reacting to was non-Western, non-white stuff, right? So I don't think he was necessarily a racist, but he gets kind of tarred with that epithet because of his resistance to so-called non-canonical works. Is this making sense? Mm. Some of that stuff that, he was resistant to now is canonical, right? But when you get down to it...
Give us an example of that.
He would... Let's see. Now that you put me on the spot, I can't think of one. He would be resistant to... Okay, I took this great course in grad school on multi-ethnic literature, which was kind of actually dated at the time that I took it because the professor was trying to take a look at points of contact between non-white literature in America. And she had some compelling points, but you could also sort of lump that under certain kinds of cultural changes that were going on in America at the same time. So it sort of dovetails with a lot of other stuff, and it also can reduce certain kinds of experiences to, not reduce them. It can take very specific experiences and try to make them universal, right? But he would have been sort of resistant to some of those gestures. Now that you put me on the spot, I can't think of particular works that he denigrated. I know he didn't like Harry Potter, and I know he didn't like Stephen King. He didn't like Maya Angelou. But he wasn't necessarily hostile to African-American literature. So there are things that show up in the canon that he thinks are canonical due to affective response, right? But then affective response or aesthetic response is also highly political in and of itself. And that's kind of like a whole other conversation. One of the ways that women and non-white writers were kept out of the canon when academic canons were being formed in the early 20th century. Well, I guess late 19th, early 20th century, which is when English became a field of study. Aesthetics was one of the claims that was made to keep certain people out, right? I can give you a more concrete example of this. In the 50s and 60s, sorry, it would have been later, it's 60s and 70s, Adrienne Rich, the American poet and feminist critic and essayist and activist, I don't think she exactly inaugurated, but she helped sort of push this recovery project and series of recovery projects that really hit their stride in the 90s, where, she grew up thinking there were no women poets except Emily Dickinson. And the truth is, if you go back to the 19th century, there were American women poets all over the place. There were best-selling American women poets. There were best-selling African-American women poets. What happened was they got obscured because the late 19th and early 20th century wanted to focus on quote-unquote aesthetics to the detriment of social or political concerns. And I mean,
give us Claude, give us an idea of some of those aesthetics, because you're painting this kind of vivid picture.
Sorry. Thank you.
Let's just dive into one or two of those aesthetics which were obscuring a wider picture.
Yeah. So. All right, I'll give you a picture. When I was in grad school, I did this really cool project. We were looking at how English was taught in the late 19th century at Harvard. I didn't go to Harvard, but the archives at Harvard are open to the public. So if you ever want to just go hang out at the archives at Harvard and you know what you're looking for, you can have some fun. My professor was interested in how English was being taught when it was first being taught as a subject. We tracked down, they digitized a lot of their archives, and we tracked exam to become a Bachelor of Arts in English at Harvard for the first time in ever. And do you know what the exam question was?
I absolutely have no idea.
Are you ready?
Okay.
What would you guess it was? Any ideas?
Claude, I have utterly zero.
Okay. This is great. You can go find it now. Mm-hmm. It was an exam that you had, I think it was 3 hours to write a 5-page response to this prompt. Describe Hamlet as a gentleman.
Oh, wow.
I have no idea how to do that. But that tells you something that they were using literature for. In the late 19th century, Harvard was essentially a sort of finishing school for the wealthy. And it was less about, in-depth analysis, and more about using the works as a kind of, I guess, aristocratic guide to life. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And isn't that kind of one of the criticisms in the mid to late 20th century of criticisms of literature, and specifically, let's say, Bloom or people around him, that fundamentally, not that they use that kind of crude example, but they would say, let's look at a certain classic work from a feminist perspective now, or let's look at it from a Marxist perspective. And you could, and this whole work gets not reduced, not even elevated, but specifically the characters and the social setting is lost, and it becomes something else completely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's accurate. It depends on what you want to do with it. You can often find sort of this critique, you can only teach but so much, and students need to know the classics or something like that. But if you're good at what you do, you can do both at the same time, right? As a teacher, it's important to have a lens, right? But you also need to keep historical context in perspective. I don't know. I guess I'm sort of like a magpie when it comes to academia. I don't think you necessarily need to do one thing or the other. You can take a couple approaches at once, but sometimes the material itself is going to demand a particular kind of approach. All right, this is really sort of wild and rambling in general and abstract. When I was in undergrad, I took a class with Christopher Ricks, who he's a literary critic. He did the definitive, annotated T.S. Eliot. He's not just a literary critic, but an editor as well. And he taught for years this literary editing institute, and I think it's sort of like under attack now at the university or something like that. But he had this class on literary editing that was like a trial run for starting the institute. And literary editing has a lot to do with looking at the text, looking at the generation of the text, looking at what went into the making of it, and then trying to figure out how to present it in a way that honors the text itself. I sort of took that approach into teaching and reading. Sometimes the historical production of a particular work will require doing certain to it in order to make it make sense. Like if you're editing Shakespeare, right? What we have are editions of Shakespeare texts that were written or that were published after he was already dead, along with sort of scripts that were cobbled together, sort of like working scripts that were cobbled together. So if you're going to make a reader's edition of Lear in the 20th century, you got to work with this thing that came out, which is very different from this one that was published, which is very different from these scripts and you cobble them together to make a kind of readable, almost Frankenstein monster version of Lear. But it tries to honor each of the pieces that went into it, right? Now, if you're working on something like a novel by Samuel Beckett, you've got the typescripts and you can look right at them. And Beckett was extraordinarily specific about what each word meant and why each word was there and what each piece of punctuation did. And his corrections are judicious, let's put them that way. So you know exactly how to edit that thing. Each different work will require a different sort of way of producing it. And I think certain works open themselves up to different kinds of means of interpretation. So, something like Ulysses opens itself up to multiple versions of interpretation. Like you can get, a Freudian analysis of Ulysses is a little superfluous because, Joyce already knew it was Freud. But a post-colonial analysis can open up avenues of exploration that are really kind of new and interesting and shine some light on Irishness in Joyce and what that actually meant. Does that make sense?
No, it absolutely does, and it kind of, obviously, all literature, let alone great literature, is constantly reimagined. Its significance, through the lens of the society at any specific time, and then also there is a different component, which is the reader male or female, or et cetera, et cetera. But what we need to do, I think, is not go through the whole canon, Claude, because that would be somewhat of a lengthy and exhaustive task. But maybe number one, how many books does Bloom say that this is the canon of Western literature? Give us that figure, and then maybe let's go through some of the selected highlights.
All right. So the thing about the list is he disowned it almost as soon as it was out. What he did was set down, how many was it? It was, I think, about 26 different authors in about 23 different chapters that represent various Western nations at various times. And he maps this all onto this weird theoretical idea drawn from, I think it's Vico, the Renaissance humanist who had this idea about how history operates. And if you really want to get into the weeds, you can do that. So the main ones are Shakespeare, Dante, Chaucer, Cervantes, Montaigne, Molière, Milton, Samuel Johnson, the literary critic, Goethe, Wordsworth, Austen, Whitman, Dickinson, Charles Dickens, Eliot, that's George Eliot, not T.S. Eliot, Tolstoy, Ibsen, Freud, Proust, Joyce, Woolf, Kafka, Borges, Neruda, the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, and then he ends with Samuel Beckett. Now there's that, and then what he has at the end is like this appendix of thousands, and he tries to represent different time periods and different nationalities, and there's some non-Western stuff in there that he thinks or seems to suggest has had some kind of influence on a lot of Western thinking. So like the Bhagavad Gita is in there. And so if you know your Emerson and you know your Transcendentalists, you can see why he would have that in there, because the American Transcendentalists were actually kind of big on their Sanskrit texts. But be that as it may, it's sort of like those 26 authors are kind of the backbone of the whole thing that he thinks are the definitive authors. And then he's got all these other sort of thousands of things running through at the same time.
All right. So, by no way, shape or form, it was Bloom the first person to say, right, I'm going to put together the list that you need to have read to be a fully formed adult in the Western world. But let's try and go back to and let's dig deep. There used to be the Great Tour back in the 18th, 19th century, and you had to go and visit Rome, Athens, Venice, etc. how much of this is just a modern version of that? Right. It's just a case of you have to do this. So we can go out into not necessarily polite society, but let's say in elevated literary society and say, well, over cocktails, or let's say over some, faux intellectual debate. I know my Proust, and you just come out with the line, which, Bloom says, well, this is, the pinnacle of what Proust was trying to say, or Beckett or whatever.
Well, see, that's the thing. That's how it was taken, and that's how a lot of these things are taken. That wasn't really his intention. Mm-hmm. He doesn't think this is a lifelong learning program in any kind of here are the sort of here's how I show myself, or here's how I grow as a human being. He is absolutely resistant to any kind of I guess, social version of the aesthetic. For him, the aesthetic is really kind of like this internal, almost narcissistic thing, but it's drawn, I think, from a kind of Nietzschean, Emersonian, and Freudian reading of, I guess, this radical internal self. And so this is where I think he's really kind of different from some of the caricatures that are made of this kind of use of literature. He really does believe, or seemed to believe, that deep down you've got this like internal self that is ultimately resistant to external pressures. It's that kind of deep down psyche, right? The deep down real you that's there somewhere. And he aligns it with Coptic Gnosticism. Let's not go down that route because it's a whole other thing. So he doesn't even think, he literally does because he was that well read. But he didn't seem to think that there was any kind of social gain to be made of any of this. And he doesn't think that you should read for that. He thinks that you should read for your own development of your internal self, in opposition to any kind of like social identity or anything like that. And that's why he was so resistant to those other kinds of lenses for reading that we were talking about. Like he was very resistant to a feminist lens because he thinks that that is reading for a social purpose. And he thinks, not necessarily in a malevolent way, that reading and aesthetic experience is antisocial. It's in opposition to the social. It's something deep down inside of you. Does that answer your question by not answering your question?
It does. It does in a long-winded, roundabout way. All right. So,
welcome to my world.
we are here talking to Claude Myron-Guza, who has a fantastic podcast, I think, called The Cannonball, and he's here joining me on Intelligent Speech. I'm going to talk, because I really admit, this is not my sweet spot. What was the first canon? And I don't mean Bloom's canon. What's the first canon that we can discern from history? I'm presuming that Virgil must have said, oh, you need to read,
Okay, what I always think of, and this goes back to the canon wars, I have no idea what an original canon would have been, but this gets back to something that you were sort of touching on, is that, all right, in the 90s there were these canon. What gets included, what doesn't get included, what's exclusionary in a negative sense, what's too far or not worthy of academic study. And that professor of mine who took us to Harvard, he sort of began his projects, very, very skeptical of the whole idea of a canon war. His real insight was that once it's allowed in to academia, hang on, this is going somewhere.
Okay, all right, okay.
Once it's allowed in, it's already part of the canon, and he was examining what a canon is. It's a standard, right? A canon is a standard list. And this gets back to what you were talking about. Every culture, every moment is going to have its standard list of these are the things. But it's always a standard list of these are the things to do X with. All right. So if we're going, I think part of the problem is if we're going back to the ancients, let's call them, the standard is going to be whatever's around, right? But you can look at different kinds of canonization. I mean, the moment of canonization that, maybe sort of, or one moment of canonization that is extremely significant would be the council to determine which books of the Bible are the canon, right? So that's one moment of canonization, one moment of standardization. And why was that done? When was it done? What is the context for doing that? Well, it's done to try to keep a coherent organization together. Does that make sense? So I don't think there is a really sort of originary canon. It depends on what's around and what you want to do with it. I think these things are always in flux. I don't think there's ever been a standard of a standard. Bloom's argument is that it's always up to great writers to determine what the canon is, because he's got this crazy idea about anxiety of influence. That was sort of like his major idea. But great writers, he says, are always drawing from other writers. And so the writers themselves are going to be determining the canon. It's not up for academia to decide. So the interaction between texts is what matters for him. But it gets back to, what do you want to do with this thing? What can you do? What do you want to do?
But other than just wanting to put out a podcast which is about literary criticism, what did you want to do with Bloom's thing?
I wanted to, in all honesty, Daniel and I don't care about Bloom. It was a neat handle for the bundle. It's a way of looking at works that, like I said, that I'm never going to get a chance to teach or discuss or research. And I can do some preliminary stuff and have a good conversation with a friend of mine about this stuff. That's really all it is it's a neat schema. There's some things in there that are just atrocious to get through, but we can have a fun conversation about it.
All right. So let's look at who in the 25 years of the canon you think, you know what, they shouldn't be on there. Not necessarily that they're problematic, because the mores of the times have changed. Right. They were sexist, racist, whatever. Let's put the isms just to one side. It's just you, Claude, don't think they deserve their place. Who are we talking about?
Now we're getting into personal animus.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of my areas of expertise is modernist British novel, and I could dissertate for days on Virginia Woolf, but damn if I hate reading her. And that's enough to get me kicked out of many polite conversations, but she's just grating to me. I hate Emerson. Every time I try to read Emerson, I just throw the book against the wall because he just gets on my last nerve. Let's see, who else do I despise in the canon? It could go on and on and on. Let's see. I'm scrolling through now. I'm looking through who's in there.
Just whilst you're thinking. So, Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Yeah.
Right? The middle of the 19th century is kind of like a high point for poetry, isn't it, really? All right. So what is it about Emerson that you despise? I must admit, I'm not really somebody... flowery language for me, it's kind of lost. And that kind of discursive way of discussing things and talking about very simple concepts and blowing them 1,000 miles high, the way that the 19th century poets used to do, turns me cold, right? But I know nothing, sir, about literature, right? Okay. But you're the guy with the big ass podcast, so you tell me, intellectually, the reason why Emerson just turns you cold.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's not even like the poems are kind of stilted. If you ever go to read his poetry, it's you can see what he's doing, but it's kind of stilted. He can't quite live up to his own project, but it's the essays that he's most known for, and they just irk me to the nth degree because he takes himself so seriously. He's often incoherent and rambly. and his I guess there's too much that I see that really does strike me as narcissistic, as antisocial in a really hostile and negative way. And I think this just has a lot to do with the contemporary state of American politics. But the older I get and the further the century wears on, the more hateful to me strikes Emerson. But I love his buddy Thoreau. Like, Thoreau gets a bad rap, but Thoreau is funny. And Thoreau is extraordinarily ironic about his own project and ironic about Emerson. So it's kind of funny to see how, you know, your own particular taste can sometimes clash against, you know, I guess the accepted norms. To get back to Woolf, what I really don't like about Woolf is a kind of classism. Like, I think she'd hate a guy like me because honestly, I'm not haute bourgeois enough. Right. And there's this way that she's, you know, her critique of the patriarchy is dead on. And I absolutely adore it. And her critique of a particular kind of patriarchal thinking, I think is wonderful. And I love to talk about it. But, her classism just irks me, and it's all over her writing. It's just something that turns me off. But if we're talking about affective response, I mean, you get down to some kind of weird.
People who value sleep, sleep on a Nectar mattress. But you're not going to believe me. After all, I might be lying. I must be lying. The only thing you know is true is that commercials lie to you. I must be lying.
Instead of believing silly commercials, trust the more than 2 million happy sleepers who sleep on a Nectar mattress. Nectar Sleep is currently running their biggest offer ever. $399 in accessories plus $100 off. A 365-night home trial and free shipping and returns. Go to nectarsleep.com today.
Penetrable core where you try to articulate what it is that you like or dislike, and it can really get personal. You know, taste, I think, really is personal.
Talking about taste being personal, I'm going to give you carte blanche to delete 3 people from the canon. You've given us 2. You got to give us another one. But Claude, you have to replace them with another 3. All right. Bearing in mind that, you know, one of the criticisms of Bloom's work, it's full of, you know, white man's burden, you know, et cetera, right? So you need to diversify this, but in a way which intellectually still holds rigor, right? So 25 years of this canon being a thing, of which people have thrown bricks at, people have held up in a high light, et cetera, Go. Who are the 3 individuals which you, Claude Maranguza, are going to add to this list to give it some contemporary heft in 2021?
Oh, yeah. All right. I'd throw in Carl Phillips immediately. Phillips is an American poet. He has been writing since, I guess, the mid-90s, early to mid-90s, and he's just exquisite. Like, he's got some of the best love poems out there. He's gay, and I guess sort of kind of came out in the middle of the AIDS crisis. So there are several of his books which are really, they're extraordinary books of elegies. But in the past 10 or 15 years, he's really become just an exquisite love poet. Just really articulating the desire in desire to truly connect with another person, and yet always recognizing certain kinds of pragmatic, practical limitations, right? We're all human, but we're all individual, and we want so badly to be connected to each other. And then there are these things that just get in the way. Just the fact that we're each individuals. He's extraordinary. So Phillips, I think, is easy in. Frank Bedart is another poet who I think Bloom ignored or just looked down on. But Bedart, over time, has really come to articulate sort of an idea of fate for the 21st century that I think is extraordinarily compelling. It still tries to work in some kind of idea of capacity to act at the same time as acknowledging certain structures that are always going to be in play over the course of your lifetime. I mean, even if that is just the historical era into which you were born, right? I think a lot of American poets try to resist the idea that there are any limitations, and Bedart comes right back screaming in. It's really astounding stuff. And who's a third? I'm trying to think who's on my bookshelf right now that is unaccounted for. Damn it, Royfield. I'm trying to blank.
Well, you know what?
You hit me with a tough one.
You've come up with two. You had two poets here.
Yeah.
No essayists, no out-and-out philosophers, no political thinkers. I don't know if the two writers
I got another
that
one.
you had. Okay, great.
I got another one.
Go for it.
I just read this book for a friend of mine recommended it to me. Mariana Enriquez. She's young, so she might do some crazy stuff in the long run. Who knows if this will last? But she's an Argentinian writer who writes horror, and it manages to be literary horror, and yet she's using the context of, you know, the last 20, 30 years of Argentinian politics as kind of like the background. Mm-hmm. And she does it in a way that's not magical realist, which I think is to her credit. Really fascinating stuff. My friend Lawrence got me to read it for on our podcast network, the Agora Network. You know, we did Agoraphobia, and I wanted to come up with a horror canon, right? And my friend Lawrence is a horror guy, and he knows the whole genre backwards and forwards. And he got me to read this, her book of short stories, Things We Lost in the Fire. It's phenomenal and terrifying at the same time. And the way he said it was, you know, usually literary horror just leaves me cold because it's not scary enough. And somehow she manages to be flowery and scary and terrifying all at the same time. So you know what? It had a real effect on me. And if what we're looking for is an affective response, I won't say that it kept me up at night, but I had a lot of trouble waking up in the morning. So it's that kind of horror where it seeps into your bones. You're like, how am I going to drive to work after thinking about this? Right. So I would recommend it.
Going back to the original list, do you think that Bloom kind of fetishized about Shakespeare too much? There's no way that any serious person who's putting together a canon of whether it's world literature, Western literature, English literature is not going to include the Bard. But he did write about Shakespeare an awful lot, didn't he?
Yeah. Well, okay. There's his argument is a little bit different than just great man Shakespeare. And I kind of see his point. All right, there are two things that make Shakespeare special. It's not his plots. It's his range of reference, like the range of trope, like the kinds of metaphors and similes. He worked with a troupe that was drawn from all quarters. So we know for a fact that he wrote for different people, and different actors probably influenced the scripts. Right. So it's not just writing in isolation, great man alone. Mm-hmm. For whatever reason, the range of reference is extraordinary. I mean, it really is a much wider range of trope than any other writer in the 17th century. And 17th century English drama is just kind of like an embarrassment of riches. If anybody has any questions about that, I can get into that. That's one thing that Shakespeare did. So his language is a lot more intense, florid, and the range of reference is wider. The other thing that he did, he took one of Marlowe's innovations, which is the development of depth, and really expanded it. Marlowe has these characters who suggest that there's psychological depth to them, and Shakespeare took that idea and really ran with it. And so he creates these characters that suddenly seem as if they have a whole life before they even set foot on the stage. it's a kind of illusion that he really works. And I think that was the innovation. Marlowe was working at it, but if you look to previous literatures, a lot of times the characters can seem very, very flat, especially in drama.
But
like if you
okay,
look to Roman literatures, yeah.
Let's just deal with that. Right. I don't know the works of Chaucer that well, but in the Canterbury Tales, you're always kind of bumping into these, I thought, quite rounded characters, of which there obviously was a backstory to.
Uh-huh.
But you said
that's why he says that, Bloom actually says that Chaucer is the backdrop to Shakespeare. Marlowe innovated it on the stage, and Chaucer's working at it. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I think you're right. That's what I'm trying to say.
Anyone can interrupt me if they say
I apologize.
I'm right. As long as you say I'm right, interrupt away.
No, you are right, and that I think is the corrective, and that's sort of what Bloom wants to argue. He thinks the Wife of Bath and the Pardoner are the beginnings of what eventually become Falstaff and Iago, which he thinks are some of Shakespeare's greatest characters. Yeah, so you're right. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Pragmatically, for the stage, Marlowe really sort of advances this kind of multiple motivation, if you look at some of his characters in his later plays. But you're right, Chaucer also, really... I kind of agree with Bloom on this. I never thought I'd say this, but Wife of Bath really jumps off the page, as does the Pardoner for all of his, because of all his nihilism. There's something sort of fascinating about that. He thinks that that's the kind of significant difference in English literature, and he thinks that other literatures respond in their own weird ways. He thinks something similar goes on in Don Quixote. That's a work that I've loved since I was 17 years old, but for different reasons. But yeah, he thinks that there are these moments, but he thinks that Shakespeare is a big deal because Shakespeare seems to be this primary moment in Western literature that really sort of takes that and develops it. I don't know if he's right. I honestly, that seems like an overstated case to me. But I do think there might be, something to it somewhere. Did that sort of answer your question as to why he's so obsessed with Shakespeare?
I just remember you saying that I was right. That's what I remember.
I think that's all that matters at this point.
What are you reading at the moment? And dare I say, can you, Claude, actually read a Stephen King novel and be not only intellectually sated, but can you read a pretty relatively straight but well constructed in terms of plot novel and be entertained?
Oh yeah, to a degree. I don't like Stephen King for my own reasons, and I'm not trying to bash King. But when, like I said, when I was doing this horror canon with my friend Lawrence, he got me to read some Clive Barker, which aside from the gore, is actually really well written. So I kind of got into it. And then there were some other pulpy things that he recommended that were really affecting. Yeah, just because... All right, it's sort of like this.
Isn't pulp a pejorative, though? You said there's other pulpy things.
No, this is literally like old pulp magazines.
Okay, all right.
No, I'm sorry. I'm not using that as a pejorative term. These were some of the Lovecraft and some of his contemporaries. Lovecraft kind of leaves me cold. I can't get over the eugenics stuff. But one of his contemporaries, Clark Ashton Smith, was just this bizarre writer who kind of draws you in with these strange, horrific worlds that he constructs. And there were a couple of other writers from the pulps that he recommended that really they were effective in their own way. Okay, look, just because you really admire something like Tree of Life, right, and Terrence Malick, doesn't mean you can't also watch the latest episode of, oh shit, now I'm blanking. I have 2 kids and I don't have time for TV or movies. Doesn't mean you can't, really watch and enjoy something like, a recent Star Wars film or something like that. Does that make sense? Just because one thing strikes you doesn't mean that another thing won't strike you in a different way.
You know what I think you should do?
What's that?
I'm just jumping in here, Claude. You should put together the popular canon. So you strip away the heavyweight intellectuals, the weighty tomes, this person, helped not only write some good stuff, they also, affected the language, the way that we speak, so you knock out your Shakespeare's. It'd be quite interesting to have an intellectual like yourself, somebody who's deep in the mire of literature, to go, here is the last 25 years popular canon, world canon. That'd be really quite interesting.
Well, I'm always fascinated. It's something that I've thought about. It's something that I'm always thinking about. There are all these kinds of works that, you walk into a bookstore and they're prominently displayed, and they've been prominently displayed since I was a youth, and they're prominently displayed now. And you're sort of like, who is still reading that? And when I read it as a kid, my question was, why is this popular? Like, all right, there's always some kind of weird vogue for like Kerouac and Burroughs and the Beats. Mm-hmm. Ayn Rand is still around. I don't know why. Have you ever tried to read Rand? It's not fun. There's some things that I think, or like Tolkien, right?
But isn't Rand fundamentally about the philosophy as opposed to the writing?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's it. And it's sort of like, if that's the case, just give me the philosophy. I don't know, but it's things like that. There are popular works that are sort of still around, and I think they also deserve acknowledgments. They deserve analysis just because they are still around, and that's where I think something like cultural studies can really make an impact as an academic subject, right? Claude.
Right. I love the fact
you're talking about a
said,
podcast.
No, not at all. Not at all. I was just saying that it'd be a great essay. But I love the way that I says popular. In my head, I am thinking of Tolkien. I am thinking of, people like Stephen King. And you went to Ayn Rand.
Oh, because it's, well, one, I don't know if you know about the political mess we're sort of dealing with in America at the moment, but two, it is like you walk into any bookstore, and it's been like this at least since I've been alive, and maybe this is an American thing. I hope it's not popular elsewhere. But it's always the same kind of bookshelf. And now that I'm discussing it seems like this is the bookshelf for like 16-year-olds who want to appear literate in some way, shape, or form, or 40 somethings who are still 16 at heart. There's this set of, I guess, iconoclastic works, which I suppose are always sort of a draw. But you're right. Tolkien, that's another one. Like, why has Tolkien persisted? I think it's because he invented a world, honestly. Like, he really successfully invented that whole world. Maybe he invented too much of it. I still have a friend who swears by the Silmarillion, but, you get the idea. But I think that's a compelling question. Why are these things popular? Why do they persist? And I think that's really worthy of analysis.
So we talked a lot about the canon.
Mm-hmm.
We've hardly talked about the podcast. When did you start it? Who'd you do it with? Do you see an end in sight anytime soon? What is your release schedule? Go.
All right. We're all over the place. It originally started because I did have this question about, I was mired in academia. I was mired in the professional aspects of these. And I really wanted to get back and look at things that, I thought were interesting and that hit me in some way, shape, or form. The original version of this was just to interview a wide different, like several different people about their interest in X, Y, or Z author, but that just kind of fell apart. The one conversation, I had some really good conversations with friends of mine, but I'm no editor. And so it got to a point where I was like, okay, I've got these different pieces of conversations. I have no idea how to put this together. The one that really stuck, that took off, like we went on for 2 hours, was Don Quixote with Daniel. The first thing we did was Don Quixote, because I knew Daniel from social media. He also had a podcast that he was doing at the time. And when everything fizzled out, I thought, well, at least I got some good conversations out of it. But then a friend of mine was in town who's a radio guy who does his own podcast and said, oh, hey, if all you need is someone to stitch it together, I'll do that. I'll throw some music on and I'll throw it up wherever you want it. I got in touch with Daniel and said, how about you and me just co-host it? And he said, yeah, that sounds great, because I had a great time talking to you. And so we just started out from there. We started in 2016, at the end of 2016, right after my first son was born. We did Dante, we did Chaucer. And then we did Dante. We did Dante sort of like, we did Inferno in November of 2016. So that gives you an idea of where my mind was at. And, the original idea is to release it monthly. Sometimes we do bi-monthly. Honestly, though, with some of the works that we do, it can stretch out to over 2 months. But we keep trying to get it as soon as possible. I think the issue is, a lot of times we're reading, 800, 900 page novels or this, that, and the other. I mean, when we did Montaigne, we did the whole of Montaigne's essays. So sometimes the length and depth of the works requires a little bit more time, but usually within a month or 2 months, we have something out. I don't see it ending unless we're dead, because the list just goes on and on and on and on and on. I mean, it's more than anyone can do in a lifetime. And I think Daniel has the idea, when this stops being fun, then we just stop doing it. But I just love talking to the guy. So, unless something horrible happens to me, I think I'm just going to be doing this until I'm in the grave.
Scale of 1 to 10, you enjoyed talking to me today?
Yeah, 10. No, I really enjoy talking to you, Royfield. We don't get a chance to chat a lot, but every time I do, you're a fun guy to talk to, so...
Listen, Claude Myron-Guza, it's been utterly fun, riveting, and interesting to talk to you as well, sir. So the podcast is called The Cannonball. I believe people can get it from all good podcatchers, can't they? So it's kind of out there.
Yeah, it's if you want to find it, you can find it. CANONBALL. It's a dumb pun that my friend Tommy made up. And, it's a little loose. It's a little rambly. I guess if you listen to me now, you get an idea of how loose and rambly it can be. But if you're curious about books that, you never read or were supposed to read and never did, and you want kind of like a light, fun take on them, hit us up.
Hit them up. It's called The Cannonball. It's an awesome podcast. It's Harold Bloom's supposed canon of the best bits of Western literature, which he kind of put it together in the mid 90s. Yeah. Why don't you dive into The Cannonball and give it a whirl? And that's been us done for Intelligent Speech. Thank you for joining us in the audience. If you listen to the podcast, you're probably saying, what audience? It's because I record these shows on a thing called Clubhouse, when I get great and interesting speakers on the show. And why don't you sign up to Clubhouse by downloading the app to your Android or to your iPhone, and then find the Intelligent Speech Club. If you're in the audience, why don't you hit up the little green icon at the top of your phone, join the club, and then you'll know when I do these kind of interesting, sometimes intimate, sometimes thought-provoking, sometimes not. But this is what definitely one of those thought-provoking ones, with somebody about a random topic which just takes my fancy. So today we talked to Claude Myron-Guza about the canon of Western literature. Was Harold Bloom right with what he said constituted what you had to read to be a well-rounded intellectual who can go out into the world and have white man's burden on his back. Listen, mate, you've been a total star. Thank you for coming onto the podcast, and long may yours reign, sir.
Thank you so much. And did enough of my irony about his project come through? I'm extraordinarily skeptical.
Listen, I'm British, so we're steeped in irony, and so I did get that. I did get that. Okay,
fantastic. I'm not a Nazi.
Listen, you're absolutely not. There you go, folks. That's the end of another intelligent speech. I'm going to stress on the word try, to really do these a little bit more regularly than I have done in the past. These are supposed to be kind of once a month. I've been somewhat hit and miss with that, but I'm going to try and nail these. I'm going to say once a week. I don't see why I can't have a nice little natter, as we say in England, with somebody once a week about a topic which deserves discourse. So there you go. That's Intelligent Speech. Hit me up. Join the club. Why don't you follow Claude? So it'll, force him to remain on the app and not just be here just for this one interview. And then also listen to his podcast because it's a lot of fun. Take care, mate.
Thanks, man.
Acast recommends more podcasts, more episodes, more great shows. Keep listening to hear a new show we recommend.
Hello, somebody. This is Nina Turner, and I want to tell you about Power Hour with yours truly, Nina Turner. The new weekly program I'm hosting for TYT will speak truth to power. We'll talk about how to fight the power, and we'll plan how to leverage the power that we, the people, have.
There has to be a consequence to these kinds of one-sided actions that are only leveled against progressives. You know who the whiners and the complainers are? It is the corporatist Dems who are in control of almost everything.
This show is for TYT members only, but for a limited time, we'll be making the first half an hour available to everyone.
Acast recommends.